I am glad to welcome you on my channel.
For almost 3 years, I lived with Ryan Mitchell, believing deep down that marriage was just around the corner. From the very beginning, he filled my head with promises of a wedding that would be nothing short of spectacular. He would say, "Sarah, just a little longer. Once we have enough saved, I'll give you the kind of celebration you deserve." He painted pictures with his words, grand halls lit by chandeliers, a designer dress, photographs so perfect they would live on in albums to show our children someday. I used to smile and shake my head, telling him I didn't need any of that. All I wanted was something simple, a day that was just ours, maybe a gathering with our closest friends and family. But Ryan would always pull me close, look me in the eye, and insist, "No, you deserve the best. Nothing less." In those moments, I believed him. I believed in us. My mother, however, never did. She lived across the country with her new husband, but she never missed a chance to lecture me over the phone or through text messages. "Sarah, take off those rose-colored glasses. If he really loved you, you'd be married by now. Don't waste your life waiting for a man who's only comfortable because you're doing all the giving." My brother Christopher rarely said much, but his wife, Laura, was blunt in ways that only she could be. "Sarah, I hate to say it, but it hurts to see you settling. The way Ryan talks to you, no, the way he doesn't talk to you. There's nothing good coming from this. I only needed to meet him once to know he's not the man you think he is. And his family, they made it clear they don't want you around." I always tried to defend Ryan, even when their words cut close to the truth. I would tell Laura that his family was just reserved, that they didn't mean any harm, that maybe they didn't know how to welcome someone like me. But deep down, I remembered every cold glance, every smirk. I couldn't forget the first and only time I went with Ryan to visit his mother and sister. It was on Mother's Day. He said it would mean a lot to his family if I came. I wanted so badly to make a good impression. But from the moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of judgment. His mother's smile didn't reach her eyes, and his sister, Emily, wasted no time cutting me down. "So, you're a nail tech, right?" she said loudly, turning to her grandmother in the kitchen. "Hear that? Ryan's girlfriend spends her days painting nails. Maybe she'll give us all a free manicure." They laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. I never felt ashamed of my job. I worked hard and I loved making women feel beautiful. But sitting at their table, listening to the mockery, I wanted to shrink into myself. Ryan excused himself to take a phone call and left me alone under their scrutiny. When he finally came back, I was exhausted from smiling through the humiliation, desperate just to leave. On the drive home, Ryan was unusually sweet, holding my hand and telling me not to take anything to heart. I wanted to believe him, so I did. I convinced myself that his family didn't matter, that what mattered was us. So I chose silence, I chose patience, and I chose to keep believing in a future that never seemed to arrive. As the months slipped by, Ryan's devotion began to fade. At first, it was subtle. He stopped picking me up after work, claiming his projects kept him at the office late. I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that the man I had chosen was simply working hard to build our future. But over time, the excuses piled up, and his absence became the new normal. Even when he was home, the warmth we once shared was gone. He no longer rushed to wrap me in his arms the way he used to. Instead, he would head straight for the shower, then settle in front of the television or his gaming console, controller in hand, shutting out the world, including me. I tried to be patient, telling myself everyone went through rough patches. Still, I couldn't ignore the emptiness that had crept into our apartment. I cooked meals he barely noticed, cleaned up the messes he left behind, and kept the laundry folded and fresh. Day by day, I started to feel less like his partner and more like his housekeeper. The man who once promised me the world now seemed content to let me carry it on my shoulders alone. Then one evening, fate intervened. I had gone outside to take the trash to the dumpster when I heard a faint, desperate rustling from one of the bags. My heart stopped. At first, I thought it was a rat, but as I leaned closer, I realized it was something else. I tore the plastic open, and inside I found a tiny, trembling puppy, no more than a few weeks old, eyes wide with fear. Someone had left him there to die. I scooped him into my arms without thinking, feeling his fragile heartbeat against my chest. His fur was a tangled mess, and he smelled of garbage, but to me, he was beautiful. I carried him upstairs, bathed him gently in the sink, and wrapped him in an old towel. I decided to name him Frodo, small, scrappy, but resilient, just like the Hobbit from the stories. When Ryan came home that night, his reaction was immediate and harsh. He wrinkled his nose, looked at the puppy with disgust, and said, "Get rid of it. I don't want a flea-ridden mutt in my apartment." I pleaded with him, telling him how I had found Frodo, how he had been abandoned and left for dead. "Please, Ryan, just give him a chance," I begged. But his face hardened, and he shook his head. "This isn't a farm, Sarah. He's just going to destroy the place. You should have left him where you found him." His words pierced me, but I refused to back down. "No," I said firmly, surprising even myself. "He stays." It was one of the few times I didn't cave to Ryan's demands. Frodo remained, curling up at the foot of my bed at night, following me from room to room, offering me the comfort Ryan no longer gave. He greeted me with unshakable joy when I came home from work, tail wagging, eyes full of love. In many ways, that little dog became my anchor. He reminded me that loyalty and devotion still existed, even if not in the man I thought I would marry. And while Ryan grew colder and more distant, Frodo filled the void, becoming my constant companion in a life that was starting to feel unbearably lonely. It happened on a gray afternoon, one of those days when the clouds seemed to hang lower than usual over Spokane. I was folding laundry in the living room when there was a sharp knock at the door. Frodo barked once, his ears twitching, and I wiped my hands on a towel before opening it. There she was, Emily, Ryan's younger sister. She stood on the threshold with a set of keys dangling casually in her hand. I froze, surprised to see her at all, let alone holding a spare key to our apartment. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside, her eyes sweeping over the room with a look of disdain that made my stomach twist. "I'm not here for pleasantries," she said flatly. "Pack your things. Ryan's moving on. You're done here." At first, I thought I had misheard. "Excuse me," I whispered, my heart hammering. Emily smirked, tossing her hair back. "He's getting married. To someone who actually matters. Someone who's going to help him get ahead in life. You've been fun, Sarah, but you were never part of the long-term plan." Her words cut through me like shards of glass. My throat tightened as I tried to process what she was saying. "That can't be true," I said, forcing the words out. My voice trembled. Ryan wouldn't, but the certainty I wanted so badly to feel wasn't there. I reached for my phone with shaking hands, dialing his number as Emily watched, arms crossed, her expression full of cruel amusement. Ryan picked up on the second ring. For a moment, I couldn't speak, my breath caught in my chest. Finally, I forced the question out. "Ryan, please tell me this isn't true. Tell me you're not engaged to someone else." There was a long pause on the other end, and in that silence, my heart knew the answer. Then his voice came, calm and almost bored. "It's true, Sarah. I should have told you sooner. I've met someone better suited for me. Someone who can help me in ways you can't. It's time you moved on." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. 3 years, I whispered. 3 years, and this is how you end it?" Ryan sighed, as if I were an inconvenience. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Just leave the apartment. Emily will make sure it's taken care of." And then he hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. Emily's smirk widened as if she had won some twisted game. "You hurt him," she said, turning toward the door. "Be gone before the weekend. He's got a real future now." I stood there, numb, the phone still in my hand. Frodo pressed against my leg, whining softly, sensing my despair. My knees gave way, and I sank to the couch, the reality crashing over me in waves. The man I had built my life around, the man I defended against everyone's warnings, had discarded me without a shred of remorse. I moved like a ghost through the apartment, pulling clothes from drawers, stuffing what little I could into bags. I didn't take much, just the essentials, a few keepsakes and Frodo's leash. Everything else felt poisoned, tainted by betrayal. When I finally stepped out into the cold evening air, Frodo trotting beside me, I looked back at the place I had called home for 3 years. The windows glowed warmly, but to me it was nothing but a shell, a graveyard of broken promises. I walked away with nothing but a few bags and my dog, carrying the weight of humiliation, heartbreak, and the crushing realization that I had lost everything. When I left Ryan's apartment that night, I had nowhere to go. The air was bitter, and each step felt heavier than the last. I held Frodo's leash tightly, clutching the small duffel bag that carried what remained of my life. For a moment, I considered sleeping in my car, but the thought of sitting there in the dark with nothing but my grief and my dog broke me. So instead, I drove to the only place I could think of, my brother Christopher's house. Christopher lived on the outskirts of town with his wife, Laura, and their 2 little ones. I knew showing up unannounced in the middle of the night wasn't fair, but I didn't have a choice. My hands trembled as I knocked on the door. A light flicked on in the hallway, and soon Christopher appeared, his face creased with confusion that quickly turned to concern when he saw me standing there, tears streaking my cheeks. "Sarah, what happened?" he asked, ushering me inside without hesitation. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. Laura appeared behind him, wrapping a robe around herself, her eyes wide. When she saw the state I was in, she didn't ask questions. She simply reached for the bag in my hand, set it aside, and pulled me into a hug. Within minutes, I was sitting at their kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea while Frodo curled up on the rug near the heater. The warmth of their home wrapped around me like a blanket, and I finally managed to tell them everything. Ryan's betrayal, Emily's cruelty, the sudden collapse of the life I thought I had. Christopher's jaw tightened as he listened, anger flickering in his eyes. "I never trusted him," he muttered. "Not once." Laura rested her hand on mine. "You're safe now. That's what matters. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." I nodded, though shame burned in my chest. I hated needing their help. I hated arriving like some broken version of myself, with no plan and nowhere else to turn. But their kindness didn't waver. That night, I slept on their couch, Frodo at my feet, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of peace. The next morning, as the kids clattered around the kitchen, eating cereal and laughing, Laura sat with me again. "I've been thinking," she said gently. "You can't stay here forever, not with the kids and the space being what it is. But my aunt left behind an old house not far from here. It's small and needs some fixing up, but it's empty. You could stay there for a while, at least until you get back on your feet." I blinked at her, surprised. "Are you sure?" She smiled. "Of course. It's not much, but it's yours if you want it. You need a place to start fresh, Sarah. This could be it." Tears stung my eyes again, but this time they were born from gratitude. I had lost nearly everything in one night, but in the wreckage, a new path was opening. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't easy, but it was a chance. So with Laura's encouragement and Christopher's quiet support, I began to imagine a different kind of future. One stripped of illusions, but not of hope. And for the first time since Ryan had shattered my life, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild. Moving into my aunt's old house felt both daunting and liberating. The place was worn, with creaky floors and peeling paint, but it was mine, or at least mine to care for. Each morning, I woke before sunrise, bundled myself in layers against the damp Pacific Northwest chill, and drove nearly an hour into town for work. The commute was exhausting, especially after long shifts, but I reminded myself daily, this was the price of independence. The little house had no luxuries, but it offered something I hadn't had in years: peace. Frodo claimed every corner of it as his kingdom, bounding around the overgrown yard like he'd discovered paradise. His joy was contagious, and watching him chase after fallen leaves or curl up by the fireplace at night reminded me that happiness didn't have to be grand. Sometimes it lived in the smallest things. On weekends, I often visited Christopher and Laura, who lived only a short drive away. Their kids adored Frodo, shrieking with laughter as they tugged on his ears or tried to race him through the yard. Frodo, patient and loyal, never seemed to mind. Seeing my nieces' and nephews' faces light up when I walked through the door made me feel useful again, like I was part of something bigger than just my own struggles. Not everyone was as welcoming, though. My closest neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Campbell, was a sharp-eyed widow in her 70s who lived across the street. The first time Frodo slipped through the fence and darted into her yard, she stormed onto her porch, hands on her hips. "You'd better keep that mutt of yours under control," she snapped. "I won't have him digging up my garden." I apologized profusely, tugging Frodo back by the collar, my cheeks burning. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Campbell. It won't happen again." Her glare softened only slightly before she turned and marched back inside. For weeks after that, she remained curt, offering little more than a nod when our paths crossed. But over time, something shifted. Maybe it was the way Frodo sat obediently by the gate each morning, wagging his tail at her, or maybe it was the sight of me trudging home late at night, shoulders slumped from the weight of the day. Whatever it was, Mrs. Campbell began to thaw. One evening, as I struggled to carry 2 grocery bags while Frodo danced excitedly at my feet, she appeared at the end of her driveway. "You know," she said gruffly, "if you keep feeding that dog table scraps, he's going to get fat." I laughed, startled by her attempt at conversation. "He earns every bite," I replied. From then on, she spoke to me more often. Short remarks at first, then longer chats about the neighborhood, her late husband, the loneliness that lingered in her empty house. I realized beneath her stern exterior was a woman who had endured her own share of losses. Slowly, she became not just a neighbor, but a companion. Between work, family, Frodo, and Mrs. Campbell's cautious friendship, my life began to take shape again. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. I started to believe in myself in ways I hadn't when I was with Ryan. Back then, my worth felt tethered to his approval. Now, every mile I drove, every bill I managed to pay, every dinner I cooked in that little house reminded me that I was capable. For the first time in years, I was standing on my own 2 feet. And though the future was uncertain, I no longer felt crushed by fear. Instead, I carried something else, quiet strength, the kind that comes only from surviving heartbreak and daring to start over. It was late January when it happened. One of those nights when the cold sank deep into your bones no matter how many layers you wore. The wind rattled the windows of my little house, and the trees outside groaned under the weight of snow. I had just settled into bed with Frodo curled at my feet when he suddenly shot upright, ears pricked. His growl started low, then turned into frantic barking. At first, I thought maybe a raccoon was nosing around the garbage bins, but Frodo darted to the door, scratching and whining with urgency. My heart raced. I pulled on my coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and followed him out into the bitter night. The air cut across my face as we moved down the driveway, Frodo straining against a leash. He led me past the gate, toward the line of pines that bordered the property. His barking grew sharper, desperate, until suddenly he stopped at the base of one of the trees and pawed furiously at the snow. I aimed the flashlight down, and my breath caught in my throat. Nestled there, wrapped in a thin blanket that was already stiff with frost, was a baby girl. Her tiny fists flailed weakly, her cries thin and raspy against the howling wind. For a second, the world seemed to tilt, my mind refusing to believe what I was seeing. I dropped to my knees, my hands shaking as I pulled back the blanket. She was so small, her skin pale from the cold, but her eyes blinked open, staring up at me with a kind of pleading innocence that broke me in two. Tucked beside her was a crumpled note, scrawled in hurried handwriting. "Please take care of her." "I can't." My hands moved before my mind caught up. I lifted her into my arms, cradling her against my chest, trying to shield her from the cold with my coat. She was lighter than I expected, fragile, as though the world itself could crush her. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with fingers numbed from the wind. "There's a baby," I gasped when the dispatcher answered. "Someone left a baby outside my house. Please hurry." Within minutes, the flashing lights of an ambulance cut through the darkness, followed by a sheriff's cruiser. Paramedics rushed forward, wrapping the child in thermal blankets, checking her vitals with practiced hands. One of them looked up at me. "She's cold, but she's stable. You found her just in time." The sheriff, a tall man with a weathered face, asked me questions as the paramedics worked. Where exactly had I found her? Did I see anyone nearby? Did I touch anything besides the baby? His voice was calm, professional, but his eyes softened when he glanced at the little girl. I answered as best I could, though my mind was still reeling. The baby's cries had quieted, and she now lay bundled in the paramedic's arms, a tiny figure against the chaos of uniforms and flashing lights. As they prepared to take her to the hospital, I reached out without thinking, letting my fingers brush against her cheek. It was warmer now, her color returning. She blinked at me, and in that fleeting moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't pity. It wasn't just relief. It was a fierce, protective instinct I had never felt before, like a flame igniting in the cold night air. I knew she wasn't mine. I knew I had no right to claim her, no promise of what would come next. But as I stood there, watching the ambulance doors close around her, I felt it in the marrow of my bones. A piece of my heart had gone with her. Frodo nudged my leg, whining softly as the vehicles pulled away. I stared after them, the snow swirling in the beam of my flashlight, and whispered to myself words I barely dared to believe. She deserves better, and maybe I could be that better. After that night, I couldn't get the baby out of my mind. I lay awake for hours, hearing her thin cries echo in my ears, feeling the fragile weight of her in my arms. The paramedics had taken her to the hospital, but in my heart, she had already carved out a space. I told myself it was foolish, that someone else would step in, that she would be placed in the system and eventually find a family. Still, the thought of her lying in a crib somewhere, surrounded by strangers, made my chest ache. Days passed, and I found excuses to call the hospital, to ask if she was still there. Eventually, a social worker gave me the number for the county's child services office. I dialed it with trembling hands, asking the question I hadn't dared say out loud until that moment. What would it take for me to foster her, to adopt her? The woman on the other end explained the process carefully, her voice professional but not unkind. Background checks, training courses, interviews, home visits. A home study where a caseworker would examine every inch of my life. She didn't sugarcoat it. Being single without a stable home of my own would make things harder. But she didn't say it was impossible. I filled out the paperwork anyway, staying up late to answer every question in detail. I listed my income, my work hours, my family connections. I sat through the background check, fingerprinting at the sheriff's office, and began the mandatory training classes, learning about childhood development, trauma, and the responsibilities of foster and adoptive parents. Each step felt like climbing a mountain barefoot, but I refused to stop. When the caseworker visited my aunt's old house, though, her frown was immediate. The place was too small, too run down. The wiring was outdated, the plumbing questionable. "I'm sorry," she said, closing her folder with finality. "Without a suitable residence, you won't be approved." The rejection gutted me. I drove home that night in silence, tears blurring the road. It felt like losing Ryan all over again. Only this time, I wasn't just losing a man. I was losing a chance to be the mother to a child who desperately needed someone. I confided in Laura the next day, choking on the words as I told her about the denial. She listened, her eyes steady, and when I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Then we'll fix it," she said simply. A week later, she and Christopher sat me down with paperwork of their own. They were transferring the deed of the house into my name. "It was my aunt's," Laura said, her voice calm. "She would have wanted it to mean something. And you, Sarah, you need this more than we do. You can't fight without the right tools." I couldn't speak. Gratitude and disbelief crashed over me in waves. Owning that little house changed everything. I resubmitted my application, went through another inspection, and this time the caseworker's tone softened. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe and it was mine. Not long after, I was granted visitation rights. The first time I saw her again, at the foster home where she had been placed temporarily, my knees nearly buckled. She was sleeping in a crib, tiny fists curled, her chest rising and falling. When the caregiver placed her in my arms, she blinked up at me and recognition sparked in her eyes. Or maybe it was just my desperate heart projecting. Either way, I knew. I whispered her new name into the quiet room, Diana. She stirred slightly, as if the sound comforted her, and in that instant I understood. No matter how long it took, no matter how many battles lay ahead, I would fight for her. She was mine in all the ways that mattered. Just when I thought things were finally moving forward, the call came. A caseworker from Child Services explained, in that carefully measured tone professionals use when delivering bad news, that my petition to adopt Diana had been denied again. "We admire your dedication, Ms. Mitchell," she said, "but there are concerns about your financial stability and support system. We can't approve the placement at this time." Her words sank into me like ice. I had worked so hard, fought through every hoop, and still it wasn't enough. After I hung up the phone, I sat at the kitchen table with my head in my hands, Frodo pressing against my leg as though he could hold me together. I couldn't stop thinking about Diana, about the possibility that she could be placed with someone else, that she could slip away from me forever. But I wasn't alone. When Laura heard what had happened, she didn't hesitate. She rallied Christopher, neighbors, and even Mrs. Campbell across the street. People I barely knew, parents from the local school, the sheriff's deputy who lived a few blocks over, even my co-workers at the salon, wrote letters on my behalf. They described me as dependable, hardworking, loving. They spoke of the nights I had sat with their children, the hours I spent helping out at church events, the way Frodo had become the unofficial mascot of the neighborhood. Reading their words made me cry in a way I hadn't cried in years. For so long, I had felt invisible, diminished by Ryan's indifference and his family's contempt. But now, all around me, people were standing up and saying I mattered, that I was enough. And then, as if fate wanted to test me further, Ryan appeared again. It was a cold evening when I opened the door and saw him standing there, leaning against a frame like he belonged. He looked different, more polished, with a new coat, a fresh haircut, but his eyes carried the same arrogance I remembered. "Sarah," he said, as though my name tasted strange on his tongue. "I heard about the baby. Word gets around." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and slid it onto the counter without asking to come in. "Consider this. Support." I stared at him, stunned. Inside the envelope was cash, thick stacks of it. My first instinct was suspicion. What did he want? Why was he here? But I didn't ask. I simply nodded, tucked the money away, and told him to leave. He smirked, as if he had done something noble, then walked back into the night without another word. That money became my weapon. I hired a lawyer, someone with experience fighting the state when bureaucracy failed children. She was sharp, relentless, and for the first time since the night I found Diana in the snow, I felt like I had a real chance. The courtroom was stark, its walls cold, but I will never forget the warmth in my chest as my lawyer presented my case. She laid out the evidence, the letters of support, my stable home, my consistent employment, the countless hours I had spent proving my readiness. The state's attorney argued, but their voice was drowned out by the truth. by the undeniable fact that I loved Diana, and I was prepared to give her everything I had. When the judge finally spoke, I held my breath, so tightly I thought my lungs might burst. It is the ruling of this court that Diana shall be placed permanently with Sarah Mitchell. For a moment, I couldn't process it. Then the words sank in, and tears spilled down my face. Frodo barked once from where he was waiting outside, as if he knew. I was shaking when they handed her to me, her small body warm against mine. I was no longer just Sarah. I was her mother. And nothing, no man, no mistake, no shadow from the past could take that away. Life after the adoption felt like breathing fresh air after years of suffocating. I woke each morning to Diana's cries or laughter, and even the exhaustion of late-night feedings felt like a blessing. Frodo became her guardian from the very first day, sleeping beside her crib, following us from room to room, as though he understood this child was now his charge too. The community that had rallied around me during the court battle didn't disappear once the verdict was over. If anything, they doubled down. Laura visited often, bringing home-cooked meals or babysitting so I could rest. Christopher stopped by on weekends, fixing things around the house. Mrs. Campbell, who once seemed so sharp and distant, turned into Diana's honorary grandmother, rocking her gently on the porch swing while telling stories from her youth. For the first time in years, I wasn't fighting alone. I was surrounded, supported, and held up by people who believed in me. Ryan appeared once, not long after the adoption was finalized. He stood on my porch, shifting his weight as though he belonged there. His words were honeyed, his smile practiced, but I could see through it now. He talked about us, about the years we'd shared, about how maybe we could try again, start fresh. I looked him in the eye, holding Diana against my chest, and told him no. There was no anger in my voice, no need for theatrics, just finality. You had your chance, Ryan. This family doesn't need you. He left with a shrug, but the moment the door shut behind him, I felt lighter, freer than I ever had before. Work became more than a means to survive. It became a way to thrive. My client base grew steadily, and soon I was able to balance motherhood with a career that gave me pride. Each paycheck, each tip, each satisfied customer reminded me that I could stand on my own. The years slipped by quickly. Diana grew into a bright, curious child with wide eyes and a laugh that could shatter the darkest moods. She ran through the yard with Frodo at her side, chasing butterflies in the summer and making snow angels in the winter. She was the heart of our little family, her joy stitching together every wound I had carried. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. I sometimes caught myself staring at her while she colored at the table or read aloud from her favorite books, marveling at how far we had come. Diana was smart, kind, and full of life. Everything I could have hoped for and more. At night, when I tucked her in and she whispered, "I love you, Mom," I felt a peace I once thought was impossible. The pain of betrayal, the sting of rejection, all of it seemed like another lifetime. Because here, in this quiet house with my daughter and my dog, I had found everything I truly needed. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when everything changed. Diana was 5 by then, all long legs and messy braids, running through the yard with Frodo at her heels. I stood at the kitchen window, drying dishes, when I noticed her slow down near the fence. She wasn't chasing butterflies or tossing a ball. She was talking to someone. My chest tightened. I stepped outside, the crisp air biting at my cheeks, and saw a man standing on the sidewalk. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with streaks of gray in his dark hair. His clothes were neat but worn, like someone who had known better days. Diana's voice floated back to me, cheerful and unafraid, as she asked him questions the way only a child could. "Sweetheart," I called, walking quickly toward them. Frodo barked once, protective, circling Diana. The man raised his hands, slightly a gesture of peace. "I didn't mean to frighten you," he said, his voice low, almost gentle. His eyes lingered on Diana in a way that made my stomach knot. I had to see her. See her, I demanded, stepping between them. "Who are you?" He hesitated, pain flickering across his face. My name is Richard Harrington, and I believe that little girl, she's my daughter. The world tilted beneath me. That's impossible, I said firmly, pulling Diana close. She was abandoned, left to die in the snow. Whoever you are, you're mistaken. But Richard shook his head, his jaw tight. No, I know her. I would know her anywhere. Let me explain. Against every instinct screaming at me to shut the door in his face, I listened. He told me a story that sounded like it had been torn from some tragic novel. Years ago, his wife had grown distant, entangled in an affair. When she found herself pregnant, she convinced him the child was his. But the lies unraveled quickly. He discovered her betrayal, confronted her, and their marriage collapsed. In the chaos, he said, his wife made a desperate move. She planned to disappear, taking their baby with her, but tragedy struck. There was an accident, whispers of foul play, and in the wreckage, he had been told his daughter was dead. For years, Richard lived with that grief, carrying the hollow ache of loss, never knowing the truth. And then, by some cruel twist of fate, he discovered otherwise. Paperwork, a rumor, a chance conversation with someone who had worked at the hospital years back. Piece by piece, he uncovered the possibility that his daughter had survived, hidden away, discarded like she didn't matter. And now, standing here, he was certain Diana was the child he had lost. I felt dizzy, holding Diana tighter as she blinked up at me, confused but unafraid. Every instinct screamed to protect her, to shield her from the weight of his words. But deep down, something shifted. His story, as wild as it sounded, carried a raw truth I couldn't ignore. The letter I had found that night in the snow flashed in my mind. Please take care of her. I can't. Who had written it? A desperate mother? A woman cornered by her own lies? My knees felt weak as the realization settled in. Diana wasn't just the baby I had stumbled upon by chance. She was someone's daughter. She was his daughter. The air seemed to thicken around us, Frodo whining softly at my side. Richard's eyes glistened with tears he fought to hold back. I don't want to take her from you, he said quietly. You've clearly given her the life I couldn't, but she deserves to know the truth. And maybe we can give her more together. I didn't answer right away. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, the future suddenly full of questions I hadn't prepared to ask. All I knew was this. My life with Diana was no longer just mine to define. A door had opened, one that led to a complicated, painful, but perhaps hopeful new beginning.